Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast. I'm Kevin Gostola, joined by Rania Kalik. Hey, Rania.
Hey, Kevin.
And we're very pleased to have on our show again a returning guest and friend, Matthew Ho, who is here to discuss running for Senate in North Carolina as a Green Party candidate. And he just made the ballot, so we offer our congratulations. It's just not an easy thing to do, but he's here to discuss his background and what he hopes to accomplish with his campaign and the kind of effect he's having and who he's talking to and a whole bunch of other issues. So thanks for joining us, Matthew.
Well, thank you for having me here with you guys. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, so we've talked to you before, but not really I know this is a dirty word, but as a politician or somebody who's going
Yeah.
out there and trying to win support from people. So and convince them to vote for you in a system where it's extremely difficult to communicate to people that they should break free from the two-party system. But it's one of the time. It's another moment in the last 20 to 25 years where it feels like the support for either party is at its all-time low.
Mm-hmm.
And so I suppose before we get too deep into the issues, let's be sure that people who are watching know who you are, know what your campaign is about. Go ahead and give us your pitch and tell us a bit about your ballot access campaign. And I know that you just got over 20,000 signatures that were able to be submitted to qualify you for the ballot in North Carolina. Let's begin there.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Running as a Green Party candidate here in North Carolina for the U.S. Senate. First time political candidate. So a lot of this is very new to me. And in order for the Green Party to be on the ballot here in North Carolina, to be recognized as a political party by the state, we had to collect signatures, and we had a threshold of almost 14,000 valid signatures we needed to collect. We collected 22,000 signatures. Of those, the various, we have 100 counties in North Carolina. We collected signatures from 96 of those counties. With that comes a verification process where we turn in those 22,000 signatures, and then the counties go through them and say this one's valid, this one's not. So we had more than 16,000 signatures approved, putting us, over what we needed by 2,000, actually about 2,300 in excess of the required number. So very proud of what we were able to accomplish here. Very grateful for it. One of the great things about it is that the way we did it is that we used our own people. We used people from the Green Party, people who are on the campaign, people who are Green Party members, people who are socialists, people who are leftists, people who are independents to do the petitioning for us. And this way, our petitioning was not just getting out there and asking people to sign a piece of paper, but it was also canvassing. So it gave us the opportunity to reach out and talk to a lot of people, listen to people, hear what people had to say. We found, as you were noting, Kevin, a really pronounced degree of support, a desire for a political change, for something different, for more parties, for more options. I mean, people would say, you guys are socialists. I'm not going to vote for you, but you need to be on the ballot. I mean, we heard that type of expression over and over and over again. So it was a very difficult process. This type of thing is definitely a form of voter suppression because it requires a degree of effort, organization, money, and time that is meant to exhaust independent and grassroots political parties. And we were able to overcome that. We had a lot of support throughout the state as well as people around the country. So even though it was onerous, even though it meant that for the first months of the campaign, we could do nothing but try and gather signatures, it also meant, though, that we were able to get out there talking to people as well as, and one other thing, it does help in a sense of shaping out the campaign in terms of getting feedback from people, understanding where we need to go in order to meet the needs of North Carolinians, particularly working families.
Yeah, I'm curious before we get into some of the stuff like on your platform that you're running on. Uh, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how you respond to people because you're talking about like the sort of voter suppression and all these like hoops that you have to jump through as a third party candidate to even get on the ballot. But there's also this massive propaganda apparatus that has, especially I think since 2016, since Trump got elected, has tried to tell the American population that anybody who's running outside of the Republican Democrat duopoly is actually like doing a disservice to progressives and anybody who wants a progressive agenda because it helps Republicans, right? By splitting the Democratic vote. So I'm curious if you could maybe respond to that like talking point because we're constantly flooded with it. We're constantly told third party is a spoiler and this is the system we have. And if you want to run on a progressive ticket, you need to run in a Democratic primary. So how do you respond to that? Why, Matthew, are you running to spoil the Democratic Party?
Right, to spoil an already rotten system.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of answers to that, and I want to make sure I talk about what our experience was encountering that. Just to say clearly, our platform does not line up with the Democratic Party platform. It doesn't. The Democrats have more overlap with the Republicans on many, many key issues than they do with us. If you compare where we are in terms of our, whether it's our principles, believing housing, healthcare, education, jobs, or human rights, wanting to end the war on drugs, various, whether it be political or economic policies that we have, we're not stealing votes from from the Democrats because there's no overlap there. We're providing an alternative, a different set of options, and people understand that. You hear that a lot, but when you're out there actually talking to people, when we'll be out, whether we're just petitioning on a street or we were attending events and festivals, and we never really heard that. That is something that's really confined to like the social media spaces, the Twitter spaces, the things you hear from the pundits on MSNBC and Fox and CNN. But amongst the people that we gathered, tens of thousands of signatures from, we very rarely heard that type of protest that, oh, you're going to split the vote. Most people, vast majority of people we encountered. I mean, it was much more common, as you saw, 22,000 people signed our petition, for people wanting something different, wanting another choice, wanting to see democracy expanded rather than restricted. People who understand that this two-party system we have is not just corrupted, but it's harming us. It's causing, a lot of the issues that are causing families and communities to suffer are due to the way our system is not responsive to the needs of working families. So we very rarely encountered someone who was upset at us for spoiling the race, for stealing votes, and most of the time, if you did that, you had a brief conversation with the person and they basically would back off on their views, and you'd say, well, why are the Democrats entitled to these votes? Why don't the Democrats have to earn these votes? Or don't you believe that, that we should have more choice on the ballot? Or look, we're socialists. Why should we be part of a capitalist party? In my own circumstances, I'm completely I'm amused by the whole thing because it's as if I owe some form of obedience or allegiance to the Democratic Party. I've never been a part of the Democratic Party, so I don't understand why I'm supposed to, right? I mean, like, so but again, the thing about it was that we very rarely encountered that. It's all, I mean, you get that nonsense on Twitter, you get that, but even to what we had here happen in North Carolina, I think, which is really instructive about this point, was that we had our primary voting occurring during the last 2 weeks of our ballot access campaign, just so happened to overlap. And so we were at the polling places petitioning, and someone would come out of the polling place who had just signed either a primary who had just filled out a primary ballot for the Democrats or the Republicans, and literally 2 or 3 minutes later sign our petition to be on the ballot. When I was there, I would have people who would have again literally 2 or 3 minutes before signed, just voted for a Republican or a Democrat in the primary race for your Senate, then come out, talk to me in the parking lot, and say, "I'll vote for you." So even in the most partisan circumstances, at the primary voting, we found such a great degree of support for what we were doing. Again, it doesn't mean that people are going to vote for us, but just the idea that we need something different. The current system is hurting us. Like this status quo, which is a deadly status quo for so many, can't go on.
And so the history of candidates like your campaign running for office outside of these two parties is to put issues out there that are not being given attention. So that is a positive. And I know that people who defend the kind of campaign you're running will typically say that if you don't want to have your campaign spoiled, then you should take up some of my issues. Like it's not necessarily bad if the campaign you're running against begins to imitate you, because it means that their campaign is acknowledging that this is important. Now, I understand that can have, depending on how they are manipulative, that can have its own set of problems for voters as far as deceit may go. But usually it's kind of an admission that they recognize that those things that your campaign stands for are valid to voters. But I would also say, and get your comment, because we've seen a fair amount of primary challenges to Democratic incumbents over the last months. And I would think that your campaign also can turn that into an asset when you run for Senate in North Carolina as a Green Party candidate, because what we've seen is a complete and total disrespect and contempt for young progressives who are running against these old dinosaur-like Democrats who honestly should retire and step aside. If we're not getting into ideology, let's at least say that these people have outlived their value as members of Congress, because they're 70 or 75 or even 80. And then you've got people like Nancy Pelosi endorsing Henry Cuellar in Texas, who's anti-choice, who's against abortion, who's been raided by the FBI, who is somebody who is pro-NRA at a time when we're seeing like a shooting a day in this country. And yet Nancy Pelosi says that they don't need to support Jessica Cisneros, who is a human rights and immigration rights lawyer. They don't need to support a Mexican immigrant woman. In fact, they're giving Henry Cuellar space to be a anti-abortion conservative zealot by saying they don't need his vote. They say we don't need his vote in order to pass this legislation. So to me, the message is very clear that the people who want to bring energy to the party are actually hated by the leadership of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, no, dinosaur is a term I use as well. The thinking, whether it be on just societal and cultural issues, but the thinking on political issues as well. The need to maintain the apparatus as it is, the political infrastructure as it exists, the need to protect their donor class, even as things change, even as you could see through campaigns like Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that the previous structures, just like Obama did, in terms of his campaigns in 2008 and then 2012, in terms of using the internet and digital fundraising, and then Sanders and AOC and others have taken that step farther. You see within the Democratic leadership, Schumer, Pelosi, et cetera, this, dinosaur mentality of, again, not just on societal and cultural issues, but on issues relating to how the party should actually operate, who it needs to be responsive to, how it can be successful. I mean, they're holding on to the strings of their big donors because that's what they know has been successful for them in the past. And, that's what they believe will continue to be successful. So, this idea, though, of issues, and yeah, if we're not on the ballot, if we're not running down here, there's no discussion of universal health care. There's no discussion of student medical debt relief. There's no discussion of annualized living wages, let alone discussion of minimum wage increase, but any type of annualized living wages. There's no discussion of rent control. There's no discussion on ending the war on drugs. There's no discussion on America's wars overseas or the crime against humanity that's happening at our border. All these different things, and we could be all here all day, all the things we left out. If you don't have a party like ours, a campaign like this to discuss those things. So it is, that I think is maybe the biggest driver for why we're doing this campaign, is to try and make sure that the people who otherwise are not going to be represented, working families, are going to be represented in this campaign. There will at least be someone who is saying, these things are not being spoken about and people are dying. In the healthcare act, we have 1,200 infants die every year in North Carolina. It's 3 or 4 times a day. A family, a mom and a dad, leave a hospital after their infant has died 3 or 4 times a day in North Carolina. We have 12 overdose deaths a day in North Carolina. I mean, those two things alone should consume an entire political campaign. And if we're not on the ballot, if we're not including debates, if we're not getting the press coverage, those things will not be spoken about, because it's not in the interests of the Democrats or Republicans to speak about these things. In terms of who's running down here for the Democrats, of the 15 Democrats they have running at the federal level, 14 House candidates and 1 Senate candidate, only one of those 15 support Medicare for all. That's it. 1 out of 15 Democrats running on the federal level. Mm-hmm. They have a Democrat, Ben Clark, 9th District, running as a Democrat for the U.S. House. He just voted for North Carolina's Don't Say Gay bill yesterday. That's the Democratic Party here. Don Davis, who beat out a progressive named Erica Smith up in the 1st District, he votes against Planned Parenthood in the state legislature all the time. I mean, so you have, there's other examples we could go through, let alone Sherry Beasley, who's running as a Democratic nominee for the U.S. Senate, who the Democratic Party cleared the primaries for. She had 2 primary progressive challengers, and phone calls from Governor Cooper, phone calls from Senator Schumer, et cetera, and those 2 people found themselves out of the primary and into House races. They cleared the path for her, and she is a Joe Biden Democrat. Nothing will fundamentally change with her in the Senate, as we're seeing happen with Joe Biden in the White House. Although I shouldn't say that, because things are getting worse for people.
And I think you just kind of hinted to a lot of the policies that perhaps you do support, but why don't you give us an idea of what policies you are running on?
Yeah, people can go to our website and look at what we're offering. We are the website's MatthewHoferSenate.org. We offer a socialist platform, a platform for working families. If you look at the issues page, you'll see, though, at the top of the issues page, it starts with democracy reform. It starts with the idea that we have to strengthen, expand, make our democracy more inclusive. I'm not going to cheerlead and say that we have the best democracy in the world. I'm not going to say that for most of our history, or all of our history, many segments of our population have been and continue to be shut out of our democracy. And one of the things that we are trying to do this campaign is get to people who have been shut out. I don't believe that people don't vote because they're apathetic. I believe they don't vote because they've been shut out of the system. But this idea of, with democracy reform, is that we need to move to ranked choice voting. We need to move to proportional representation. We need to abolish the filibuster, abolish the electoral college. We need to get money out of politics. We have to do something about our judicial system. We're seeing the worst of it in terms of how the Supreme Court has been functioning and operating, and the decisions coming out of it. But that extends throughout our entire judiciary. this appointment for life, highly politicized appointments for life. Though that has to be reformed and redone. And there are a whole host of other aspects that need to happen with our political system. Otherwise, everything else we're talking about will not be able to be accomplished. And the second thing on our list is climate, for more or less the same reasons. If we do not take on the climate, and it's getting to the point, and I think many people agree that there's no prevention, there's no there's no trying to scale back the climate collapse that is happening already. We are going to have to endure it, and maybe we can mitigate it to a degree. But with the climate collapse that, again, we are experiencing right now and will only worsen in the coming decades, to the point that this is an existential issue for human civilization, that, of course, has to be a priority. But what you see, though, is that all these things work together. If we don't get money out of politics, if we don't reform our political system, we will never have real action on the climate. With regards to the climate, if we don't do an economic Bill of Rights, which is part of our Green New Deal, we will not have a society that can survive the climate crisis, that can survive the climate collapse. One example is if we do not have if we believe that housing is a human right, and we do not have the institutions and the structures, the systems in place to ensure that housing is a human right for people, 25, 30 years from now, as our coastlines, as we're losing communities up and down our coastlines throughout this country to climate change, where is that internal migration going to go? Where are people going to find homes? I mean, we're already seeing a climate migration happening in this country. Here in North Carolina, you'll meet people from California who say, we moved here because we don't want to deal with the wildfires anymore. So we're already seeing that type of the effects of climate in 100 different ways, but it's also going to be putting a great strain on our societal infrastructure, and then that ties into this economic Bill of Rights, ties into healthcare, ties into education, ties into jobs. We believe in universal healthcare, of course, that's a human right. And the same with education, from pre-K through higher education through university, should be something that is a public utility, basically, something that everyone has access to without cost. We pick that cost up as a society because it benefits our society, and the same thing too with jobs. We believe in the job guarantee. We believe in annualized living wages. So there's a whole host that goes into that economic Bill of Rights that we could do a whole show on. And then there's other issues as well. I've hinted at before, ending the wars overseas, ending the surveillance state that we live in, ending the war on drugs, shifting from a program of 50 years where we've treated substance abuse and addiction as a criminal issue rather than a public health issue, addressing what's happening on our border, where, under Joe Biden's administration, more people are being detained, including, last time I checked, 1,000 children still separated from their families. We never hear anything about this anymore. But that's, if it was happening anywhere else in the world, we would declare that a crime against humanity, because it is. So, there's a lot of different issues that we see as interrelated, as intersectional, if you will, that you can't untie and that we have to address together. And then, of course, these are the things that separate us from the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and the Libertarian Party as well.
I want to take advantage of your background as someone who deployed and has been in theaters of combat and has worked for the U.S. government, to speak to what it's like to come back to the U.S. and find that there's just a record number, an insane number of guns that the population has, and that feeling that people tend to have, that in order, it's part of our culture. It seems like in order to feel safe, people think they have to go out and purchase a gun or a weapon in order to protect their home. Like individually, we build in this individual sense that might be the way to safety. And if it's not that, then obviously there's another element where we're asking people to turn their homes into like surveillance fortresses where they're monitoring everything, which just creates a whole lot of data that the government can then use to target you, actually, and then others in your neighborhood. But leaving that aside, I I noticed your tweet, so I'll put this up on the screen about what you suggest should be done about gun violence. And you said treat gun violence as a public health measure to start. That in itself is expansive and revolutionary, and government policies that are violence-based solutions that create further societal violence. New gun regulations, including no same-day sales, etc., is one of the proposals to consider. So this is hugely topical. This is really important. We've seen over the last several days, it seems like a shooting a day. And then most recently we had, I believe it was in Wisconsin, if I'm getting it correct. It was a funeral for someone who was killed by police, and there was a shooting at the funeral. And I don't know if that doesn't more vividly illustrate what this country is dealing with right now in terms of rampant violence. I don't know. I don't have a better example.
I think there's many reasons for it, but I think certainly having 400 million guns in this country is a huge part of that. We can despair about that, because what are we going to do? We're going to build a time machine and go back 30 or 40 years and stop that process from happening, where we had this, really, you see this phenomenon occurring in American politics of the Second Amendment. This really happens, I believe, in the Reagan administration, really starts to take on as they tie, God and gun together, uniting that type of, really this white nationalism, which I think drives so much of the gun craze. But, you have to also be careful when we talk about it, because, most of the guns that are killing people are not the assault weapons, or not the rifles. I mean, certainly at these massacres they are. But in terms of the bulk, the tens of thousands of gun deaths we experience every year, most of those are caused by handguns. I mean, so we have to do something that goes further than banning assault rifles, because the problem is so prevalent. And a lot of it is a cultural issue. It's a societal issue. We have I'm a big. I've been a big adherent to Cornel West for decades now, since I saw him speak when I was in college in the early 90s. And Cornel West says, we live at the intersection of might makes right and greed is good. And I think the schoolroom in Texas, where those children were massacred, is an intersection point for that, where you see that. You also understand the killings at the funeral you just talked about, Kevin. When you talk about that, I'm immediately reminded of the fact that, for the better part of 2 decades, we bombed funerals all throughout the Muslim world. The part of our targeted assassination program, the drone strike campaigns and everything else, was to kill someone half the time, or more than half the time. We didn't even know who we were killing. And in those around, innocents be damned. But kill someone, and then at that funeral, attack the funeral and kill the people at the funeral. We did this. The United States did this over and over and over again throughout Pakistan, Afghanistan, in Iraq, most likely in Africa as well, in Somalia and Libya, and possibly other nations. I mean, so when you have that type of mindset that exists in the government, that we are going to kill like this wantonly, and you have a government that's been doing this its entire existence, where, the use of violence, to whether it was to conquer the continent, right, the genocide against the first peoples of these lands, the Native Americans, or whether it was the use of force to keep African Americans in slavery, and then the resulting century and a half of oppression, utilizing law enforcement, police forces, whether it's prison incarceration, whether it's Jim Crow, whether it's the war on drugs we see now. This use of violence by the state to achieve its means, I mean, that sets the tone for the rest of our society. It plays into this myth of redemptive violence. It plays into this fantasy of the American patriot who stands up against, and that, of course, itself gets succumbed into all the white nationalism. But, this idea that we have to understand that so much of our government policies are violence-based solutions by default, and how that has an effect on our society in total, is something that needs to be addressed. And then there's a host of other issues we can get into in terms of what can we actually do practically in terms of reducing gun sales, in terms of massive buyback programs, in terms of big thing right now are these red flag laws, all kinds of things that people say, well, that makes sense. That's probably a good way to go about this. But and to your point about someone who has used these weapons, seen these weapons being used, I've seen murdered children in both Iraq and Afghanistan. It's the idea that we're at this point, though, is, again, I go back to West's thing of might makes right, greed is good, and we have to understand it in that totality. That no single piece of legislation is going to fix this, that we have to fix our entire society. And not saying that we don't need legislation, but, I think that's the point I've been trying to get at, is that the violence is so pervasive. And violence by the state, violence by the government doesn't just mean the violence that, say, police or military forces inflict. It's the deliberate withholding of healthcare, right? The deliberate imposition of poverty wages, of the the financialization policies of the U.S. government for the last 50 years, where the United States government has deliberately pursued policies, put into place laws, tax codes, regulations, etc., that enable corporations to put money back into themselves or into the stock market, into banks, that reduce workers' wages, that force workers to live on credit. That's all a form of violence itself. It doesn't have to be from the barrel of a gun that we have this violence in this nation. It's something we have to, something that again, if we could build a time machine and go back, I don't even know where we'd start, but we don't have that option. And so we have to, of course, do what we can now with what we have. And the hostage, the way that we're held hostage, though, to a few gun owners in this country is absolutely sickening.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a really good point about the normalization of violence. It's also like the normalization of death in America as well. Like we just accept mass death in so many ways that we don't even realize aren't normal. Everything you just said and more. I mean, there's so many like diseases people die from that are totally preventable.
Right.
COVID, we let 1 million people in America die of COVID like it was no big deal. And so I think that's a really good point. But, speaking of violence and the kind of violence America inflicts, I mean, the other issue, of course, is the other sort of issue hanging in the backdrop of everything at the moment, on top of the gun violence, is the issue of the war in Ukraine. And it's all we hear about. Like, we're just surrounded by it in the media, on social media, on mainstream media, nonstop, endless coverage of Ukraine. We have to arm Ukraine. We have to give Ukraine more weapons. Anybody who doesn't agree is a Russian stooge. And I'm curious, you're actually on the ground campaigning, talking to normal people. Is this issue even coming up? And if so, how are you as a Green Party candidate dealing with it? Because, of course, much like the propaganda about third parties is concerned, there's also this third parties are just Russian agents in America kind of propaganda. So there's it kind of ties into the whole Ukraine narrative, and Russia's the enemy. So I'm curious about how you're dealing with with sort of like that group of issues.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, Rania, because people, we didn't find many people at all asking us about Ukraine, talking about Ukraine. If it was in the context of the fact that it's costing them $4.50 to put gas in their car now. They're making that connection, the inflation, but very rarely, I mean, almost never did someone talk about Ukraine. People talked about the things that were important to them. I mean, again, it was in the order of what we heard from people. It was about the enthusiasm for something different, for political change, for fixing the system, however you want to describe it. And then it was cost of living. And then the war on drugs, because we were really pushing the war on drugs messaging. And we had a lot of people who were very receptive to that, not because they want marijuana to be legalized so they can get high in a park or something like that, but because they've seen the very real effects of the war on drugs on their families, on their friends and their communities, whether it be because of the overdose deaths, over 100,000 each year now, or it's the lasting effects of that criminal system. These people who 10, 15, 20 years after getting some nonviolent drug charge are still dealing with it. I mean, I have family in my neighborhood. The drug charge was years ago. Cops, the parole officers still show up. And the guy, my neighbor's got to deal with that in front of his kids, as well as it's always there, and so those are the things we heard about. That's what we heard about. The war in Ukraine, now very, very seldom, because it's not affecting people. And I think people rightfully see it as something that doesn't involve, how do I put this? I think people rightly see it as this is an issue between two megalomaniac structures in DC and in Moscow. That this is a dirty war, a war about fossil fuels and larger issues of commerce. But this is an insane war, a war that didn't need to take place. That I think many people rightfully don't divorce this war in Ukraine from the wars of the last couple decades. I think most people look at it and say, well, it's the same. It's our same Pentagon we have. It's the same people in Congress. It's more or less the same people in the White House. So how is this war different from all the other wars? And, it certainly is, there are aspects of it that are different. But this is something I found when I first started speaking out against the wars. People would ask me, well, what's the differences between Iraq and Afghanistan? And, compare and contrast. And I'd fall into that trap. And eventually I realized there is no difference. As long as the United States military is occupying these countries, there is no difference in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Everything else is you're missing the forest because of the trees here. And the same in this war in Ukraine. If you want to take and maybe this is what is so maddening, because as you say, if you speak against the official narrative, you somehow try and bring a context or nuance into it, you're a Putin apologist. So if you don't take the line that the war starts, history starts in February of this year, nothing that occurred before matters. 15,000 dead people in eastern Ukraine from fighting over 8 years, that somehow is separate. We don't need to talk about that to understand what's happening in Ukraine now. That's just complete madness. But that's the way our political media, military industrial complex narrative shapes it. And so, understanding, I think, which most people do, that this is the culmination of decades of militarism, and they don't want any part of it. They don't see any need for it. Not to say their hearts aren't going out for the Ukrainians, not to say that they don't want peace there, but not to say that they support what Russia's doing. None of that's true. I think you could say all this and still condemn Russia. That's what I do. They launched a war of aggression, of invasion and occupation. That doesn't diminish, though, the decades of pushing between the U.S. and Russia that went on that has led to this proxy war. So I think, again, people understand that this war is the consequence of decades of militarist policies of the United States. I don't know if they'll use that term or not, but they see that this is where you keep pushing somebody, they're going to push back. And we keep going around the world, putting our noses in places where it probably doesn't belong, instigating things. And they see, again, that it's the same people over and over and over again who are leading these wars, prosecuting these wars, speaking about these wars. I was just listening to Secretary of State Tony Blinken speak yesterday about the war in Ukraine. First of all, he talks about it as if the United States is some type of just, interested bystander. He says, right. He says, we're not sure how this is going to play out. As if like, I don't know how this game's going to end. I don't know if they're going to pull the pitcher in the 7th inning or not. Like as if they have no say in this war as they're sending, right, billions of dollars of weapons, as we basically were paying the salaries for the Ukrainian army now. It's our war. If you're paying the salaries of an army at war, guess what? That's your army and it's your war. No matter how you want to, the semantics you want to use, that's the reality of it. So, but I was reminded, because I met with Blinken when I resigned in protest over the Afghan war. It's the same people. All those people who are in the room now making the decisions about the war in Ukraine. And, people understand that and they get that. And they're seeing the effects in terms of the inflation that's been caused by it. The seeming priority on sending weapons to kill when we can't even get things here at home that we need. There's no ability to look at COVID. I mean, we're seeing COVID cases spike here in North Carolina, and money's running out. Money's running out. They can't even approve money to pay for tests and taking care of people and vaccines, et cetera. But money goes right away to Ukraine.
Yeah, people see this, and I think right now, as we're recording this show, it's something like 5% of the country has low community spread when it comes to COVID right now. That means 95% is hitting these thresholds that the Center for Disease Control used to believe was a moment in which social distancing measures or some type of health measures had to be put in place. We had to control crowds. But we see a complete lack of political will to continue these policies. And I've got a couple things I'll throw at you here as we begin to wind down this show. First, we've got a report this past week that the White House is going to sell killer drones to Ukraine. And so every other week for the past 100 days that we've had this war, we see something new where the escalation seems to be ensuring that this is going to go on for much more longer than this year, that it's going to maintain itself as the source of record profits for the military industrial complex, which is really what is benefiting from all of this. But I think when I, in my head, consider what crystallizes all of this, what you were saying, Matthew, I listened to you saying that the people you speak to understand that this Pentagon is the same Pentagon that was involved in Iraq. It's the same Pentagon that was behind the Afghanistan War. It's the same Pentagon that is now re-upping its military operations in Somalia, supposedly to confront an extremist group that we need to continue to bomb, and saying that's the solution. But, is that even voters that understand this? It's actually, there are former presidents who understand it. And I want to play this clip just because I think it's one of the best illustrations of what you are talking about.
In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway. 75.
And so I play that and I ask you for your comment, just because I think on one hand, it's easy for us on the left to see that and just get frustrated because here's someone who hasn't been held accountable. He's involved and implicated in war crimes, and him and others around him, including Dick Cheney and others who have died now, like Rumsfeld, never were given any moment where they had to really answer for what they did to millions upon millions of people. But on the other hand, I kind of find it satisfying to see him make that admission or gaffe or whatever. Is I think like the idea that you can draw a through line as far as war goes, that in his head, he at that moment is recognizing that the Iraq war bears some distinct similarity to what is unfolding in Ukraine. That to me it's a bit of a like vindication for everything that we've done for the last 15 to 20 years. And I think people who watch that clip go, you're damn right. That there isn't much difference. And the people here in this country are engaged in that kind of war making just as much as the country we're saying we have to fight right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're right on both points there. There is a through line, this continuous line of history that exists. Look, when I was in the Pentagon, God, 2 decades ago now, talking to Don Rumsfeld, one of the few times I ever talked to him, and we were standing. I was a captain of the Marine Corps. He was just chatting me up for some reason because he was being nice, I guess, or whatever. We're killing time, and we were standing in front of a portrait of Eisenhower, and Rumsfeld said, "You know how old I am? I used to work with that guy. That's how old I am." And not knew him, but worked with him. And then, that really, I've thought about that a lot because it made it click, because Eisenhower, when he was a young officer, knew Civil War generals. I mean, so the distance in history, this through line you're talking about, is not very great, right? I mean, so it is the same people, the same mindsets, that the things that Rumsfeld took from the Republican Party in the 50s. Think of the worst of it, the McCarthyism. Think about Eisenhower's coups all around the world. The mass buildup of nuclear weapons. All these different things, right? That's what he took as a young man, right? And I mean, so it just in that process, it continues itself because I mean, certainly what Bush with President George W. Bush. And the laughter that occurs when he says those things in that clip is just obscene, and I'm reminded, and I can't remember who it was who said it. It might have been General Westmoreland who said it about the Vietnamese. He said during the Vietnam War that life is cheap for the Asians, paraphrase, which of course was mocked and derided at the time. And people said, I think you're looking at the mirror when you're saying that. You're the ones who are napalming villages. But we continue to see that throughout the United States. It's not others who view life as cheap, but it is the United States that views life as cheap. And whether it be the wars overseas or the fact that, 1 million plus people are dead from COVID, that we lock up more people in this country than anywhere else in the world in our prison system, and we choose to do things regardless of which party is in power. Those things continue. But, this idea, though, that, accountability, I get asked, why are you running? And the two reasons are, one is for accountability. One is because there has been none. The things that I've seen, the things that I've taken part in, the things that have been done to others, has been no accountability. And whether that be for the wars overseas or for the economic situation here, for the prison industrial complex we have here, I mean, all those things, there's been no accountability for it. And then the other side of that, is the other half of that is what's occurring now. I mean, I'm motivated by so many people in my life who are suffering because of a lack of health care. I got way too many people in my life who are living lives, people in their 40s and 50s, where they are having to check their bank accounts before they go to the doctors for themselves and their family. That's the way they live their lives, making that type of dangerous choice. But I when I started talking about the war on drugs several months ago, I went back and I said, how many people do I know have overdosed and died? I counted 6 and I stopped counting.
Whoa.
Yeah. I mean, overdose deaths in the veterans community are quite, it happens. And whether it's suicide or whether it's accidental, but I mean, and so to jump back to another point we were talking about before, when you get encountered by these partisans, the people who are more loyal to their party than to anything else, who view this as a game, who are part of the team sport, red versus blue. And, more than likely, more often than not, the person who's yelling at me about, you're going to allow Ted Budd, who is the Republican Senate candidate, you're going to allow a Trumper in the office, blah, blah, blah. That person doesn't have any issues with health insurance. That person doesn't have people in their family or in their lives who are suffering because of these government policies that, look, with health insurance, just to stay on that, before the pandemic, the estimates were 65,000 people a year dying because of the lack of health insurance before the pandemic. With the pandemic, we know, because of studies done, that upwards of a third of the people who've died, so 300,000 people who've died from COVID, have died because of a lack of health insurance. And we're going to say that other countries view life as being cheap, so the desire for accountability, and then the urgency that I see in my own life among people I love for something to be done before, it's only worsening. And at what point does everything just collapse? And I think that's not hyperbole. I think that's when you start to bring in other aspects like climate, you start to understand how collapse is something that is very, really, very, very, very possible.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's been really great to talk with you, and we wish you the best with your campaign. Is there anything else you want to leave listeners with? We've got your site on the bottom of our screen, MatthewHoeForSenate.org, for those who are just listening and not watching. Any parting words, Matthew?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate this, Ryan and Kevin. I appreciate all the work you guys do. You guys have been terrific on a host of things for quite a while now, for years now, so thank you. MatthewHoeForSenate.org. If people can support us, whether people want to volunteer or if they can donate, we can use all the help we can get. We are a grassroots third-party campaign going against the corporate two-party system that will spend hundreds of millions of dollars to buy the election here in North Carolina. So if people can help, please go to MatthewHoeForSenate.org. And thanks, guys. I really appreciate you all and what you do.
All right. Well, we'll have to have you back later on when we get closer to general election day, and hear how everything's been going. But until then, I guess we put up our general things just for people to know that you can support our show, the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast, this way, and also become subscribers by going to our patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. We're on Rockfin as well as another place if you want to find our show that way. And we'll be back next week with another show.